Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer, as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Glad to be here as always.
Welcome. Several big topics again, and this time it's a very big topic. Iran war, US Israel strike on Iran. Last time when we ended, we were talking about will will they do it, will they not do it? There were many reasons to do it, but perhaps pragmatism also came in, perhaps they will not. But in between, it has all happened. Help us understand what is the latest there, how do you see it, how is the world seeing it from that part of the world, and then we'll see where it is going from here on.
Well, we are now well into the second week of strikes on Iran. US and Israel continue the joint operations that are actually highly integrated more than ever in the past after Israel has joined CENTCOM. Britain, France, and some of the other European countries are providing defensive support in the background, and some of the Gulf states launched defensive actions. Qatar launched very limited retaliatory strikes after attacks on the U.S. base on its territory, but they were mostly symbolic rather than substantive. Um, so it remains largely U.S. and Israeli operation. Um, to date, U.S. proposed a ceasefire, which Iran rejected, and so far there's been 8 Americans killed, 150 wounded, and there's been also casualties around the Gulf. Many of them are actually Southeast Asian workers. Um, so we are seeing the level of intensity of the conflict that is surpassing the 12-day war. There's also been a number of Israelis killed and wounded after various attacks by Iran. And we are seeing a new dimension to this conflict, which is the energy sector being seriously affected. At one point, the prices of oil rose to over $100 a barrel, at which point Trump proceeded to try to reassure the public that the war is close to completion. The prices fell back down, and then he said, well, we actually are not done. So we are seeing some volatility in the markets. Part of the reason for that is that Iran's been choking back the Strait of Hormuz, where 1/5 of oil and gas trade passes through. And that skyrocketed shipping and insurance prices. And as many companies now need to reroute around the Horn of Africa to deliver the goods, it's taking longer and it's riskier as well. U.S. at one point promised to escort the tankers, but so far that has not happened. Meanwhile, several of the major oil and gas hubs in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere have been damaged or taken offline completely by the strikes, which is also contributing to the crisis. The crisis is not yet considered to be catastrophic, but the Gulf states are running out of interceptors, and if they're not able to basically reconnect to the delivery and to get all their main hubs in order, they may not last very long in terms of being able to actually fulfill the needs and the contracts of deliveries, which would put a severe strain on the US and others who are not affected by the strikes to uh, up the delivery to make up for what would be lost under such circumstances, and we are wading into uncharted territories. Another dimension is that Iran started mining the areas around the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman. U.S. has destroyed a number of these mining operations, but it's unclear how many of them are presently active anyway. So none of these things have happened in the past, and interestingly, Iran is largely responsible for them. Although Hezbollah has been engaged with Israel, overall it's Iran and not its proxies that it's carrying most of the damage here. And it is also apparently adjusting to the war. It quickly reappointed a new supreme leader who is the son of Ayatollah Khamenei, Mashtaba Khamenei, and while many have considered him quite incompetent and not particularly well liked, it is very clear that he's very much continuing the, the ideological dogma of his predecessors, and he already sent a missile with his name inscribed on it in Israel's direction. So, whatever the case may be, whether he will prove to be far less effective than his father remains to be seen. But for now, at least ideologically, he's very much holding the line.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, who is winning? Who is losing? Because the war is still on, and Mr. Trump he said that almost in his way, it's almost complete. The war is almost complete. Something like that. I want to understand where do we stand? Are there any winners still? What will be the win? Look, how does a win look like in this situation, and for whom?
Well, I'll be one of the contrarian voices who believes it's too early to tell. There's been people clamoring for each side, namely because US quickly attained air superiority, but that is not necessarily the decisive factor, because US also had air superiority during the Vietnam War, and we all know how that long that lasted and how badly that ended or didn't end, depending on how you look at the situation. Vietnam is still communist, despite some opening in relations to the West, especially in recent years. Uh, so the problem here is that success is hard to measure when it's not clear what the objectives actually are. Throughout this debacle, Trump has communicated varying objectives depending on the time. At various points, it included supporting the protesters. The protests have long since died down. Then he narrowed the goals to destroying the nuclear program, but that has barely been touched in this round of attacks. Another objective was to destroy the ballistic missile program. That too has had only limited success because at least parts of that program are located underground, and US has limited arsenal to deal with underground facilities. It requires persistent use of cluster bombs, and US has a limited number of those. Even though Trump promised that defense producers would quadruple their production, I don't think some of the weapons are easily replaceable in short time. So the timer has changed from about 4 to 5 days to maybe 4 to 5 weeks, depending on who you ask. But the 4 or 5 weeks are considered the maximum simply on the basis of available weapons. US has tried to adjust to the shortage of interceptors, for instance, by engaging with Ukraine and trying to acquire its smart uh, um, anti-drone technologies, which it's also now selling to Gulf states. And Ukrainian soldiers have been apparently going to be guarding some of the U.S. bases in Jordan. They are selling. They're potentially engaging with Qatar and now with Saudi Arabia, and there have been talks with the UAE and other countries as well. What will ultimately come out of these talks remains to be seen, but it seems at the moment that Ukraine's technologies are the most effective for the least cost. And it may be something that India too may consider in the future, given the proliferation of drones used by Pakistan in the last kinetic escalation, and given the relative effectiveness of Ukraine's counter drone defenses, battle tested in Ukraine and considered to be more effective than traditional defense systems, in many ways far cheaper. Even the S-400s that India recently purchased from Russia, they've cut their limitations in battle in Syria and elsewhere, um, in Ukraine and elsewhere. I mean, and they're also quite pricey compared to these new counter drone technologies. So I think Ukraine will be at the vanguard of innovation in that regard, and the battlefield is changing rapidly, and Iran is also becoming very much a drone war in many ways, and Iran's been able to circumvent the superiority of Western weapons by relying more on volume of cheaply mass-produced drones, which are able to do mass economic and infrastructural damage and are easily replaceable compared to expensive and hefty American weapons. So we are seeing that Iran is prone to be more resilient simply by virtue of adjusting to these techniques, and there is a serious concern that all involved could be forced to withdraw early without declaring a decisive victory, much less regime change, simply by virtue of limitations of weapons. It's not just U.S. that's running out of them, but all of the Gulf allies that are under attack have a shortage of interceptors that are not easily replaceable, and U.S. is already dipping into South Korean weapons, which um, leaves that part of the world open to a potential incursion or attack from China, North Korea, and etc. So uh, Russia is benefiting from the situation, first by de-risking itself from Iranian weapons, and second by diverting resources away from Ukraine and to the Middle East. And nevertheless, it's still continuing to suffer significant territorial losses on the battlefield in Ukraine. So we can't say that this benefit is unlimited. It's just helpful in certain ways, but not when it comes to real kinetic activity. So,
Absolutely.
what would a victory look like? It depends on how you define it. But the fact is, the Trump administration has vacillated between regime change and more limited goals. Israel has pushed for a regime change, but no one has a clear plan for what that would look like. And any regime change discussion would require two things that are currently absent. One is a unified opposition and a clear leadership, or plan towards deciding on leadership, and second, Iranian military and RGC defecting in sufficient numbers to make a difference. So far, we've heard of individual cases and diplomats defecting, but nothing that would give the opposition substantial military advantage on the ground.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Looks like the real winner is Zelensky here, Ukraine here, because the drone technology that supposed he offered earlier on to the US, apparently was denied, and now he is in great demand. Almost around 8 to 10 nations have already asked to understand better about the technology and acquire. Suddenly, Ukraine is or Zelensky is turning from an liability into an asset. Is this the big gain that Ukraine has indirectly gained from this? Just think of a situation, that you are not thanking us enough. Suddenly, the person is being asked for help to understand, how to deal with cheaper Iranian drones. We'll come to that, but first, let's
Mhm.
look at the situation here from every player involved. Look at from the US point of view firstly, because how will they declare? Is Mr. Trump caught between this? Earlier he was telling help is coming, we are coming there. And now without boots on the ground, how will you help? It means that door is almost closed for a long time. The new leadership in Iran, now how will they start looking at it? Secondly, Irina, if you look at it from US's point of view, their high ticket radars have been destroyed, two of them by Iranian drones. One, if I understand, in Qatar, but more than $1 billion. Another one in, say, Jordan or somewhere. So two of them, and one big one is a $1 billion one. Is are only six of them in the world. One is in the UK, one is in Greenland, one is destroyed. The other three are in the US. This I read from one of the top-notch places. Now, this is a big loss for the US? You have already lost some soldiers. You don't know beyond. You are almost blinded in that part of the world. That is where Mr. Zelensky has to come in. Is the gain only for Israel from that point of view? You are not able to defend the places where your bases are in the Middle East. From that point of view, does it look like to be a victory for the US in any sense? Is it more that they have gotten exposed? A country like Iran can attack at so many places without having that much of wherewithal. Are they exposing the chinks in the armor of it? And the biggest thing is, you saw the intelligence also on the girls' children's school. That was apparently flawed. 175 children getting killed on firing on the attack on the girls' school. Apparently, earlier intelligence was that it was closer to a base, but then that has not happened. And initially it has happened. So from every aspect, if you see, and this is what our different reports are saying, I don't know how much they are true, but looks to be true. How does it look like to be, in that situation for the US? How can they declare something very tangible with the new leadership coming in Iran?
Well, the new leadership in Iran is not all that different from the old leadership. In fact, it really is the old leadership minus one 86-year-old and a few officials which are easily replaceable. The dogma of the regime has not changed one iota, and that's the only thing that really matters. Very much the trajectory shows continuity. So if there's going to be some more serious damage to the institutions down the line, it will be, as Iran officials themselves put it, through economic pressures resulting from these wars and a combination with sanctions, rather than just from elimination of a few key um, key people there. Unfortunately, I think US miscalculated in that regard. I think they started the strikes before being fully prepared and before coordinating with the regional allies, because they thought of an opportunity to eliminate Khamenei and the head of RGC simultaneously. But I think they overestimated the damage that it would do to the regime ideology if nothing else. It rallied the hardliners, and what we don't see is the mass outpouring of opposition on the streets as a result of that. I'm sure many people are happy and are quietly celebrating through commentary on social media, but that does not win wars. So that was one miscalculation on the US part. The other miscalculation is that at the end of the day, Iran is 90 million people, and that's a lot. And they also have a significant militia presence in the region. Even though it's been weakened by Israeli strikes, it has not been fully eliminated, and the recruitment process continued since the last engagements. None of it ever fully went away. Plus, if you look at all the proxies in the West and sympathizers and ideologues and Russian and Chinese rhetorical boosting, the numbers are quite high. So it's not surprising that Iran is able to multitask quite effectively. It's also, I think there's been a tendency in the West to exaggerate or to guess hypothetically the level of support for the West that exists in Iran. There is no, to be sure, a very clear critique of the regime, especially lately after all the economic measures. But whether ideologically how many Iranians are actually aligned with the US Israel is very hard to tell. There's an assumption that there's a fairly significant number based on the Israeli assets and assorted people commenting online, but really it's extremely hard to measure. I think US has been making very wild guesses based on the reporting by the opposition groups in the West, which do not necessarily fully reflect the sentiment on the ground, and certainly not the level of organization that exists for any type of support for US operations. So it's not surprising that the regime knows the region far better than the US, that is present only in limited numbers there, and that they're able to manipulate the numbers, the optics, and the pressure points effectively. Add to that the communication and coordination problems with the US allies and the internal differences in the region. And you have a situation where Iran knows exactly what it wants, and everybody else has very divergent opinions on what direction to take. And that makes it very easy to exploit. Now, regarding the situation with the optics and you know whether Zelensky is the real winner here. I would say that sadly, in any war, you're going to have a situation where collateral damage of civilians occurs sometimes by accident. I'm not saying that who the jury is still out on the final situation of who was responsible for this death, but unfortunately, it happens. I am sure that if US was responsible for it, it was not a deliberate strike, which is not what you can say about Iranian operations. They have used civilians as human shields in various conflicts, and they have done everything possible to bring these strikes upon themselves, and thus endanger everybody who lives there. Broadly, they're responsible for anything that happens, including they bear the moral responsibility for the unfortunate and inevitable accidental collateral damage. Sadly, the US could be doing a lot more to engage with the people, to show support to rhetoric, and to show sensitivity to internal interests, and not make statements like Trump saying that he's going to be the one placing the new government. That's not his place in a sovereign country. If he, if in fact he's defending the sovereignty from the illegitimate revolutionary regime, then he should not be also playing the same games that Britain played, putting a Shah on the throne and actually setting in motion the events that led to the Islamic Revolution in the first place. I think there's a very dangerous angle that the Trump administration is pushing in that regard, and they should be far more sensitive in how they make their case for the war, not just for internal domestic audiences, but also in terms of galvanizing public opinion in the Middle East.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, among the Middle East countries, even though Iran attacked a lot of, these neighboring countries, how do you see this whole relationship between the, Middle East countries, you know, emerging after this? Will they become enemies beyond this, or do you think they will start re-understanding this whole dynamics and US's role? Like even Iran will understand means how much, or any other country will understand how much they can expect help from countries like Russia or China. The same way, the Middle East countries who are much more aligned, who have both bases of the US, they will start also thinking about how much they can actually, trust US's shield for themselves in that regard. How do you see that happening going forward?
The problem is not that the alliance, the CRINC alliance, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, has natural limitations due to distrust, disparities, and various other differences. That's not surprising. What is far more concerning is that US and its allies are not able to maintain a far more united front in the face of these ideological adversaries, and exploiting those differences far more than they are. So far, U.S. has been quite ineffective in drawing on the Russia-Iran situation. For instance, Russia was found to be providing Iran with intelligence to target U.S. weapons. U.S. basically told them to stop doing that, and Witkoff came out and said, "Well, they promised to stop doing it, and we'll take their word for it." There's no reason to take Russia's word for it. Well, why would anyone take their word for it? So this is just one example of a self-own, I would say, of a self-defeating action. Another is essentially allowing Russia to benefit from the oil purchases related to the and oil waivers and exemptions related to the rising prices in oil. All of that was avoidable had U.S. coordinated better with other countries before the war. Now it's giving Russia a financial breather that Russia could really use at this point. So, and simply alienating European countries and having them politically condemn quite openly these actions as either illegal or poorly thought out is not great for anyone's morale. It's the sort of political division that any of the bad actors will take advantage of and exploit endlessly. Um, so, before worrying about the cohesion between your enemies, we should first ensure that we have some level of cohesion on at least basics related to this conflict.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And from Israel's point of view, if you look at even from the US, you see US and UK discord on the US of on the use of UK base. There also it has ended not very well. In terms of the US and Israel itself, that attack on civilian infrastructure, even from on Iran, that side, and even from Iran's side, attack on desalination plants. How is this looking? Especially the Israel attack on a civilian infrastructure. That was very difficult to digest. Will it? And in fact, looks like even U.S. and Israel have a very different approach of understanding this from that point of view. How do you see this part of this warfare?
Well, here's the thing: a lot of civilian infrastructure in Iran is actually linked to the regime and is controlled by the local bureaucrats. So it may be civilian in the sense that it's not managed by the military, but it's not really civilian in the sense that it's still part of the regime bureaucracy. Mm. And unfortunately, uh, it's difficult to separate it for the public. But in terms of communicating, Israel should be doing a far better job explaining what they're doing and why, and also offering support to the civilians who are affected by these attacks. It should be aiming to damage the regime institutions as much as possible while aiding with humanitarian assistance and or other matters the people on the ground, and building support for its actions rather than alienating potential allies. Um, clearly, the attacks on civilian infrastructure create bad optics, and they create issues that Iran can exploit, and critics of these operations can exploit, and they do. And we hear that domestically in the U.S. all the time. And for an average person looking at what's going on, it does not look good, and it doesn't look like there is clear coordination, and U.S. and Israeli leadership know what they're doing. To be honest, I think the Israeli leadership knows a lot more about what they're doing than US, but they do have different aims. They do have different concerns. Israel is far more concerned about about essentially limiting Iran's operational reach, and it's understandable. It presents a direct existential threat to Israel, not in the same way. It is also a threat to the US, but not in the same existential way. I mean, Iran cannot rival US power, and it's also a smaller country. But still, none of that excuses the complete lack of clarity that has emerged as a result of this war, the conflicting messaging, the changing narratives, and the inability to stick to um, a, a few clear objectives understandable to an average person who has to pay tax money for supporting these efforts and has to hear stories about people being injured or killed and not even knowing whether it will accomplish anything more than a brief pause in Iran's capabilities until a next reset and Arctic hostilities. None of it is cheap. You spent billions of dollars in just the first 100 hours of the war. So that too has to be justified by something more than just a temporary setback. If US is not fighting as efficient as it should and could, then maybe we should have a different military leadership that is able to account for the costs and still get the results needed. Um, that brings us back to the innovation, Ukraine's innovation. We've had years to accustom ourselves to the new rules of war and the new frameworks for fighting this type of warfare based on the 4 years of full-scale invasion in Ukraine, not to mention the decade of asymmetrical warfare and experimentation in Ukraine, and yet still US is failing to take advantage of all that, and that is also a completely avoidable mistake that is costing us money, lives, and credibility. Um, I think after all of this is eventually over, we will need to reevaluate our approach to policy because we cannot continue like this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now looking at the whole Europe side itself, France extending its, nuclear deterrence to Europe. How does that like? Is it a end of NATO the way we used to see it, and now this whole thing, France, finding its place, looking at things from Europe perspective, looking at defending themselves or their allies in their own way, rather than fully depending on the US. How does this look like? How do you think this is going to pan out post-war, just it is happening right now?
Well, there is indeed a growing European concern about long term security reliability and the need for stronger continental defense structures. France has long maintained that its nuclear force protects its vital interests, and the current shift places more emphasis on the idea that European stability forms part of this interest. Now, in Europe, the security environment has been changing as a result of the full scale invasion of Ukraine. The European states are increasing defense spending, expanding arms production, and reconsidering how much they rely on external, read American protection in light of Trump's threats and anti NATO sentiments. And France sees an opportunity to position itself as the central military power inside the EU by emphasizing its independent nuclear capability. So the French nuclear force is smaller but modern, and it's built around a submarine-launched ballistic missiles and air-delivered nuclear systems. It's designed for survivability and credibility rather than sheer numerical size for its own sake. And the purpose has always been to guarantee that any existential threat to France, which defined by France, by the way, what that actually means, would face unacceptable consequences. So this reflects political signaling as much than as immediate operational change. So currently, the moment is perfect for Macron to push the idea of European strategic autonomy, arguing that Europe should have the ability to defend itself even when US priorities focus elsewhere, as they increasingly are. And France has actually promoted this idea for years. The current security climate gives the argument more attention because of uncertainty about long term global security commitments and shifting geopolitical priorities. But also, Germany has joined this discussion because it remains Europe's largest economy despite not having its own nuclear weapons. Any French nuclear umbrella discussion naturally includes Berlin because German security is at the center of European stability. And this actually increases France's political leverage inside European defense debates and strengthens its voice on future EU military planning. But the Eastern European countries view the French move through a different lens. Countries that are closer to Russia are more concerned on immediate deterrence credibility. They want reassurance that any extended deterrence concept would include clear commitment and operational planning, not just verbiage. These states are continuing to strengthen their own conventional forces while watching how France actually ends up defining its offer. And Poland, for one, announced that it is preparing to try to acquire its own independent nuclear weapons down the road. So we could be seeing a start of a new nuclear race in Europe.
Absolutely, start of a new nuclear race in Europe. And before we move to Ukraine, Irina, one thing that crosses my mind is that there was this whole talk of Pakistan's role in this, Iran war. What could be their role? And also, they had a partnership, NATO-like partnership with Saudi Arabia, if I understand. Attack on one means attack on others. Then Saudi Arabia that faced some attack, if I understand. Help us understand from Pakistan's overall role here, and how will that come into impact with the NATO type, deal that they had with Saudi Arabia. Only when there is a major attack, or even this sort of an attack, will also be counted amongst that.
Well, Saudi Arabia would need to invite Pakistan to defend them for Pakistan to launch retaliatory action on Saudi behalf. However, broadly speaking, Pakistan is not looking to join the war just yet. They are trying to balance between public sympathy for Iranian people, security ties with Saudi Arabia, and they need to avoid a direct clash that would overwhelm their economy and internal stability. They understand that once they enter the war, that creates pressures they cannot necessarily control. And the government is seeing this as a containment problem, not so much as an opportunity for military action, despite some comments recently. Uh, so Pakistan has a long border with Iran. It has labor and financial ties with all of the Gulf states. It's got a working relationship with China, a difficult and complicated history with the United States, and a large domestic Shia population that follows events in Iran closely and in many cases are sympathetic to the Iranian regime. So these ties pull Pakistan in different directions. That's why Pakistan's position looks cautious and sometimes inconsistent. That caution is real, and there are structural limits to what it can do for any one of those relationships. Domestic politics, for once, is one major reason why Pakistan is going to stay out for the immediate future. The public anger over the war has already fed protests, sectarian tensions, and broader political stress. The US consulate was attacked in Pakistan. The government does not want a regional war to spill into the streets in a way that adds to internal instability while it's basically in the middle of a face-off with Afghanistan. Any move seen as siding openly against Iran would create immediate pressure inside Pakistan due to the level of internal sympathy and some of the political parties openly coordinating with Iran. Any move seen as siding with Iran would strain ties with the Gulf states and the United States as well. So the military issues also create limitations. Pakistan is already under pressure elsewhere, in terms of border security, and as I said, coming out of military operations in Afghanistan. So a second major crisis on the western side tied to Iran is, they needed like a hole in the head. It would stretch logistics, it would force attention away from their current issues, and it would also strain political control. Meanwhile, the security establishment in Pakistan is focused on preventing strategic overload, not adding to it. And the economic reality is even more serious. Pakistan is highly exposed to energy price shocks and external financing stress. Some of the issues it's facing includes rising oil prices, hitting inflation, transportation costs, electricity pricing, and of course, public outrage related to all of the above. And already the fuel costs are exacerbating the public unrest. A direct role in the war would make that pain even worse, and it would damage investor confidence at a time when the economy remains very fragile. So Pakistan's policy in actually based on controlled distance. It's trying to avoid military involvement while keeping channels open to all of the participating sides and to project an image of a stable security actor. Um, it wants to prevent Iranian suspicion. It wants to avoid disappointing its Gulf funders, and it doesn't want domestic unrest to turn into a national crisis that will destabilize the country even more. Um, Pakistan will use language that shows support for regional stability, Muslim solidarity, or concern over attacks on Iran. But that is a far cry from actually preparing to enter the war. We may have heard some speculation, and indeed, Pakistan has been raising its profile on the international defense stage with the help of Saudi Arabia. But in some ways, it's actually in competition with Iran rather than in coordination with it. So again, I'm not really sure that Pakistan is in a position to do much about it unless it's pulled into the war, um, despite its best efforts to stay out.
Absolutely, absolutely, and Mr. Trump has been time on having great words for the political leadership as well as military leadership, and he has also promised lots of oil for Pakistan, and I'm sure that will be found whenever the time is right. Be that as it may, how do you look at how India is navigating this particular situation? Initially, U.S. announced that India can buy, Russian oil, 30-day waiver, and from that point on, and then just after that, if I understand the chronology, there was this whole attack on Iranian ships that were in India for joint exercises, and one of the ship was attacked by the U.S. submarine near off the coast of Sri Lanka. Many people lost their lives, Iranian Navy people. The other had to get back into Indian waters. Both the things. How do you see from there Indian leadership is navigating this whole, impact of war on different levels?
So economically, I think the issue is pretty obvious. As the prices are rising, India becomes more dependent on cheaper Russian oil, and especially with the instability in the Gulf states, even procuring enough oil at any price will become an issue. So that's pretty straightforward. Regarding the other matter, interestingly enough, shortly before the strikes, India was already there's been tensions rising between India and Iran for years, including Iranian meddling, particularly with the Shia community in India, but also assorted incidents, Houthi attacks, Houthi and pirate attacks on Indian ships, and all of these things that strained their previously pragmatic economic relationship. So, the way I see it, India is trying to stay out of the conflict as much as possible, primarily because it does not want to stretch its defenses even further and have to deal with the complications of all of that. Also, it has um, accused US of causing an embarrassment by attacking a naval vessel belonging to Iran during prearranged military exercises, since at that point that vessel was not presenting any danger to anybody, and yet was treated as a military asset for the war. Um, why would India care about the optics of this arrangement? Probably because it feels it cannot rely on the outcome of this war. And at the end of the day, India will be stuck in that neighborhood, with the common deals going through Charbahar, while U.S. can limit its, can decide to withdraw and claim victory at any point in time, and then continue as usual. So, quite frankly, I think these are not ideological considerations; they're practical reality related to the consequences of the region and the fact that there is no off ramp that US is offering to contain potential damage. Um, the other issue is, India did um, say it treated those ships as a humanitarian matter. It even proposed the asylum for the Iranian naval participants, but they chose to remain near Sri Lanka and ended up getting killed in vast numbers. Uh, it may be also an opportunity for India to demonstrate goodwill on a humanitarian level without also having to take any action. After all, Iran is very unlikely to take up such gestures. They're ideologically committed and are committed for to following through with all of that. So at the end of the day, I think India is not sympathetic to Iran, but it is also concerned about it. It shares in a number of alliances, at least symbolically, between BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's a great deal of economic activity, diplomatic back and forth, and even some military engagement. Um, so until US and others have something clear to offer that is diametrically opposed to that, India will maintain some level of balance even at the peak of the crisis. And so far, US, to be fair, has not pressured India to do more in terms of cutting ties with Iran. It has not been a major issue so far.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Now let's move on to the last topic of the day is the Ukraine and Russia war. Does this Middle East situation change the whole optics of the Ukraine and Russia war? With Ukraine talking of innovation and selling it to the US and Gulf states, changing its whole dynamic. Now other nations, as I talked earlier on, that looking at buying from Ukraine will become as a changing itself from a liability to almost an asset for the many players that were looking at it from another point of view. And it's also putting out robot soldiers in fact in the field, some sort of that amidst talk of Russia also using a new weapon in its deadly attack on Kharkiv. How do you see this whole thing happening? Means does Ukraine now become a different player altogether in the game with vis-a-vis with Russia, as well as dealing with especially with its dealings with the US?
Well, regarding assets and liabilities, Ukraine was never a liability. It was always advantageous to the Western states because it provided a buffer between Europe in particular and Russia. And it basically was fighting European battles on their behalf. And um, the less support Ukraine got, the more Russia expanded its operations into Europe proper. So Ukraine was, any course of action is going to have its costs. The question is, what do you want to pay for? Do you want to pay for a very short term temporary appeasement that ends up in nothing, or do you want to pay for real security? And for a long time, Europe was putting off what was needed to be done, and US under Trump in particular, but also under Biden, clearly underestimated Russia's commitment to expanding its military action, despite you know subpar economy and subpar military um, possibilities, and the result was expansion of conflicts all over the world, including in Europe, and the loss of U.S. and Western credibility, the expansion of Russia's political influence, and the loss of valuable opportunities to arm and prepare for future conflicts. Turns out Russia is not the only field. Now we have Iran and countries like UK, who have been admittedly helping Ukraine, have not been actually expanding their own capacity and not even innovative and relatively cheap methods that Ukraine has adopted, uh, which require fewer personnel, uh, much less expensive types of weapons, and faster training. All of that could compensate for the lack of assets and defense funding that countries like UK have managed for years. But now they're facing potentially two fronts. And just because UK is not siding with the US in terms of engaging in airstrikes doesn't mean it won't be treated as an enemy by Iran regardless. So it's huge missed opportunities for Western states. They're catching on, and I think you will see that it's not just the Middle East, but also Europe that will soon be massively acquiring Ukrainian weapons, know-how, skills, and essentially mindset. Uh, it will take time, and it will not always align neatly because the methods of warfare are evolving constantly. And I think while Europe is focused on this particular latest gimmick, something new will happen, and they're kind of lagging behind in that regard. But I think it's better than nothing, and I think they're finally starting to wake up to the reality of Ukraine being an important potential partner and not simply, just a producer of cheap technologies. Now, Russia too, it's been suffering massive losses of occupied territory, but it's also been managing to carry out major large-scale strikes, including most recently on Kharkiv, as part of its continued pressure campaign against Ukrainian cities. And that attack fits into Moscow's long-running strategy of using long-range fires to weaken infrastructure, damage industrial capacity, and exhaust Ukrainian air defense resources. So the background to these recent developments goes to Russia's shift towards standoff warfare after failing to achieve rapid battlefield breakthroughs earlier in the war. Russia increased its use of glide bombs, modified ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and combined strike packages designed to overwhelm air defenses. The approach focuses on volume and adaptation rather than technological surprise alone. There's been some speculation about a new weapon coming from changing the changes in strike patterns rather than confirmed introduction of a completely new system. Russia has been modifying existing weapons by improving guidance kits, increasing range through glide conversion, and also combining drones with missile strikes to create layered attacks. These adaptations can produce unfamiliar impact patterns even when the base weapons are not entirely new designs. But one important development is Russia's continued refinement of glide bomb tactics. These weapons are actually older bombs, which are retrofitted with guidance and wing kits that allow them to be launched from aircraft outside Ukrainian air defense range. They're cheaper than missiles, and they can be used in large numbers. And their growing accuracy and range have made them one of Russia's most important strike tools against cities near the front. Another factor to consider is Russia's use of mixed strike timing. Drones often arrive first, which forces Ukrainian radar activation and interceptor use and caused Ukraine to expand their interceptor arsenal. So then missiles and bombs follow once defenses are already engaged. This sequencing increases the probability that at least some weapons will penetrate defenses. And this can make attacks appear different because damage patterns reflect multiple weapons types arriving one after another. Another issue is electronic warfare. Russia is continuing its efforts to interfere with Ukrainian navigation signals and drone defenses. So, signal disruption can reduce interception rates and create confusion during incoming attacks. Improvements in electronic pressure can make existing weapons more effective without introducing entirely new platforms. Uh, all of that is compounded by psychological pressure. Kharkiv is close to the Russian border and remains symbolically important because it resisted early capture attempts. So, continued attacks signal that Russia retains the ability to threaten major Ukrainian cities even without major territorial advances. And this reinforces Russia's pressure strategy aimed at long term exhaustion. So the most important story here is actual adaptation rather than any breakthrough technology. Russia has shown persistence in improving how it uses existing systems. Production adjustments, guidance improvements, and strike coordination have increased effectiveness over time. This reflects industrial war learning rather than sudden technological leaps. Meanwhile, Ukraine's response is focusing on improving interception rates, dispersing infrastructure, and strengthening passive defenses, which include hardened facilities and rapid repair capacity. So, the contest between strike methods and defensive adaptation is continuing to shape the operational environment there. Each side is adjusting faster than in traditional wars because technology cycles are shorter. There is no confirmed revolutionary weapon changing the war overnight, but Russia is improving how it uses existing systems through modification and coordination. That's basically the bottom line here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Irina, for our next episode in 2 weeks' time, when we talk, what is your idea? Will this war be still continuing on? If it has ended, how will it end? How will this whole Europe thing pan out, especially with Ukraine, coming out in a bit of a different light altogether? How do you see it? What we will be talking when we meet next?
Well, Trump is a very unpredictable personality, so anything can happen. But I do think the US will come under greater pressure to reduce its operations as energy crisis continues and as allies in the region are running out of weapons. So that will kind of put pressure. And I think Trump, at some point, I don't know if it's going to be in 2 weeks, but eventually he will be forced. I think he will declare a symbolic victory. He will claim that some of the objectives were met. I think there may be some additional strikes on nuclear sites at some point. And I think after that, he will basically say that it's over, just like what he said after the 12-day war. Until next time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Until next time, there is so much to understand and learn about the world, and for that, we keep on coming to you every 2 weeks on the world according to Irina Shukerman. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.